Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and good morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world. And we are nearly 2/3 of the way through our El Alamein fortnight, and it's proving to be really informative. People are loving it. Views are up, so that's fantastic. Now, one of the themes that has come up, I think, in every show we have done previously is the clearing of the minefields, the crucial early part of the first part of the second Battle of El Alamein, when the paths were cleared through the mines and then the armor and then the infantry poured on through. What we haven't examined is the techniques developed to clear through those minefields, and that's what we're talking about today. So my guest is over in Australia, and Dr. Kit Kowol. He's researching his own grandfather, because his grandfather was heavily involved in the clearing of mines there, and he's done this presentation previously to the Royal Engineers Historical Society, and I found him via my contacts there, Sean and Philip and others, and he's come on to talk about today. Just before I bring him in, as it's a different time of day, I might get a few new people watching us live. If you are a new person who's discovered World War II TV in the last few days or even hours, welcome aboard. Please don't forget to click the notification button and the little bell so you receive updates about new shows, and maybe consider sharing what we're doing with your friends, and or consider becoming a patron or a channel member. But without further ado, I'm going to bring my guest in, and we will talk about mine clearing. So good evening, Kit. How are you today?
Hi there, Paul. I'm doing great. How are you?
Very well. So, I mean, as I said there, we've explained it. We've covered mine clearing, but only in that peripheral kind of it happened, and now we're going to dive in deeply. But in your case, as I said there, it is your grandfather who was involved in this. So I've been asking every other historian as I've been doing these shows about when your first understanding of the Battle of El Alamein was in your life, because for me it was playing El Alamein in the back garden with sticks as the Enfield rifles, and it was in all the comics I read. In your case, when did El Alamein kind of loom on your horizon?
So, I mean, I've got a slide for it later, but I'm sure you know there's a fabulous picture of the sappers clearing the minefield by Philip Collier. And that picture with its kind of vibrant images of shells bursting and sappers bent over and tracer going over the top, that was took pride of place in my grandparents' dining room. So when kind of Granny was droning on about something, I'd start kind of looking at that picture and thinking about what it must have been like for my grandfather to be there. But it very much was a case of me kind of imagining it, because he was a man who didn't really like to talk at all about his war service. In fact, it's notable that after he died, a lot of the people he was working with at the time, once his obituaries came out, had no idea at all that this man had had a DSO with 2 bars, and had been involved in these exploits. So for me, actually, this last month doing this research on my grandfather has been fantastic, because it's the first time that I've really been able to dig deeply and find out a little bit more about it.
And dig deeply is a strangely appropriate pun when we're talking about mine clearing. And the thing is, we started off this series talking to John Parshall about kind of some of the iconic imagery that comes out of El Alamein. And one of them is kind of bagpipes and minefields and that sort of swirling mist and sand and those people moving from that Pathé footage that we all kind of grew up with. And so it is absolutely part of the legend of El Alamein. But of course, it is also a fundamental, real part of the history of El Alamein. Those mines did have to be cleared. And another big theme we've been talking about is the whole international aspect of North Africa, in that it's loads and loads of different people fighting for the Allies, and in the same could be said about the Axis as well. So all sorts of different weapons in use. We've talked about the daisy chaining of 88mm shells to make defenses, different types of Italian mines, German mines. So we're now going to dive in and look at how the process of identifying and clearing those mines was, especially when we get to El Alamein, with the speed it had to be done. Because I remember meeting a Royal Engineers a veteran from Normandy, Brian Guy, his name was, and I was asking about mine clearing. He said, well, there's all about fast mine clearing and there's slow, systematic mine clearing, and it's a different type of job. It's like asking a welder to weld it. Do you want a quick job, or do you want a job that looks really good? And mine clearing has an element of that, in that there's a swiftness of approach if it's about getting through fast, or there's a methodical, we're going to be building a hospital on this area, let's clear this field over maybe hours or days. But anyway, I'm getting all excited because I love the idea. Yeah. But you've come up with a PowerPoint which you'll be controlling. So folks, we'll do questions at the end today because we just will. I think because of the, in a sense, narrow focus of this, there may not be too many questions because I think it'll be covered. But if you do have questions, we'll do it at the end. But basically, over to you, Kit.
Brilliant. Yeah. So Paul did mention that I'm a historian, but I should just give you a quick clarification. I'm very definitely not a military historian. I'm a political historian, and I'm actually writing a book about the Second World War. But the political side of things and the way that the Conservatives, the Conservative Party in the UK, adapted and thought about the Second World War and put forward plans for their own kind of New Jerusalem. So that's my professional work. This is much more of a hobby, but I'll crack on. So I'm talking about my grandfather, as I kind of mentioned, with a degree of trepidation, actually, because he was a very modest man who didn't like to dwell on his kind of military exploits, which was is very definitely a noble quality, but I must admit something of a pain for the historian. Nonetheless, and I think though he probably would have hated it being said, I'm talking about it because he did actually play quite an important role at Alamein. So prior to the battle, he set up the 8th Army School of Mine Clearance and devised a standard drill for mine lifting, one which I'm told by Sean and others actually still forms in many ways the basis of the British Army mine lifting technique to this day. And during the battle itself, he was responsible for clearing the pass through the minefields for the 10th Armoured Division as OIC of the 3rd Cheshire Field Squadron Royal Engineers. And it was also during this action on the 9th to the 23rd of October that my grandfather won his first DSO, to which 2 bars were subsequently added, one in Yugoslavia and then one in Korea. And his clutch of medals at one point actually made him the most decorated serving soldier in the Royal Engineers.
Wow.
That, though, was, actually a complete news to me as a small boy, because I just remember a quiet, kindly old man, slightly distant, but with a certain twinkle in his eye. And for reasons of family law, Brigadier P.N. Moore was only ever known as Grandindin to me. And in my mind, he's just always dressed in his favourite corduroy trousers and his baggy and sometimes quite holy woolly pulley. So the only glimpse of his rigorous commitment to process was his insistence that one should never talk while one was fishing, even in the presence of cross-channel Federaries, it turned out. And the only suggestion that being his driver was once described as being the most dangerous job in the British Army was the way that he chivied my grandmother along to pursue the local hunt in their Peugeot 205. Anyway, let me show you the next slide. So my grandfather, who I'm going to refer to as Moore from now on, was born on the 13th of July, 1911. His father was the inspector of schools down in Somerset, and he was educated at Clifton College in Bristol before going on to study at Trinity Hall College in Cambridge and Woolwich thereafter. Here's a picture of his class from Woolwich, and he is the incredibly grumpy looking man, second from the left. There he was a noted sportsman and won first place in the RMA team's modern pentathlon in 1931, which was the same year he was commissioned into the Royal Engineers. He joined the Bombay Sappers and Miners in 1935 and saw action in the Second Waziristan campaign, where he was mentioned in his dispatches. What we know, though, we don't know much about what happened in India, except that what for him was the most exciting part of it was his pursuit of a tiger that had been marauding and mauling local villages. And he went out, shot the tiger, and it always lived in the attic of my grandparents' house, where it terrified us young children who snuck in to have a look at it. Well, they would later discover, after he died, clearing out his papers, that unfortunately one of the guides on the tiger shoot had also been shot during the hunt, something that wasn't mentioned to us at the time. So you get an idea of my grandfather as someone who had kind of a love for danger and excitement. And in these and later years, he went on to learn to fly and also take part in ocean yacht racing. And for a man of his kind of class background, he was someone whose life was really made in the army. And it allowed him, the pre-war army, to engage in activities and pursuits that he never could have dreamed of as someone who is the son of a relatively lower middle class man in England in the 30s. So it was probably then, I think, his desire to see action rather than any kind of ideological commitment that saw him attempt to secure a sabbatical from the army in the late 30s so that he might join and fight in the Spanish Civil War, something that the War Office wisely turned down. Action, though, as it turned out, would not be something that was lacking in the Western Desert. In 1940, he had passed out of Staff College exams, and he was made Staff Captain Q in 8th Brigade of the 4th Indian Division, based in Pune and later in Egypt. The opening salvo of the Desert Campaign, the Italian invasion of Egypt in September 1940, followed by Wavell's riposte 3 months later in Operation Compass, saw Moore and the 4th Indian Division engineers involved in the construction of what was known as the Bagoosh Box, constructing anti-tank obstacles and laying various minefields. These used these type of mines, which are known as the Egyptian pattern mine, which was described by Moore as, quote, dangerous to lay and still more dangerous to lift, end quote. And later in the conflict, during Rommel's first offensive in 1941, Moore and the 4th Indian Division would become expert in laying these mines to halt the speed of the German advance. And Moore was involved in the development of a standard method for setting and recording the laying of these mines, something that in a piece of classic army humor was referred to as the Indian rope trick. And it was during one of Rommel's lightning raids in April 1941 that Moore was briefly captured while attached to the 4th Field Squadron RE, 2 miles west of El Alamein, which is ringed in purple on this map. When the enemy was spotted attempting to bring an anti-tank gun into action 2,500 yards from 2nd Armoured Division's headquarters, Moore charged off on his scout car and engaged the enemy, killing 4 and causing the remainder to flee. He then reportedly volunteered to use his scout car to cover a retreating anti-tank battery by bringing its light machine gun into action against the enemy vehicles. And while this allowed the battery to escape unobserved, it left Moore isolated and resulted in his capture. He did not spend a long time in an Italian prisoner of war camp, though, because within 4 days he'd managed to escape and actually overpowered some of his captors with his bare hands. He walked through the desert, surviving thanks to aid from local Bedouin tribesmen. He was always very grateful to them in later life. And also by drinking the water that he found in the radiators of abandoned vehicles across the desert. So he succeeded in crossing over both the German and the British lines. And he said, actually, it was getting back into Tobruk, which was the most dangerous part of his walk to freedom. And he arrived there in such an emaciated state that actually his oldest friend from school didn't recognize the kind of collection of skin and bones that appeared when he turned up. He was awarded an MC, as he found out when he got back, for his role in this delaying action. And his time in the desert continued to be an adventurous and dangerous one. One account of the 3rd Cheshire Field Squadron RE, which Moore, who was promoted to major, commanded for much of this time in the desert, described a story in which he found a group of sappers pinned down by a German machine gun. Having asked why the gun hadn't already been silenced, Moore reportedly grabbed 2 grenades, climbed into his jeep, and proceeded to drive directly at the gun. He was blown into the air by a mine, and those watching presumed he'd died. But he returned a few minutes later carrying his injured driver and told the sappers that the gun would nonetheless soon be out of action. Apparently, what he managed to do was, after he was thrown out of the Jeep, was to hang on to his grenades and wedge them beneath the wheels of the truck. He did it in such a way that he knew that when the Germans came to pull the Jeep out, that they'd go off and destroy those around him. So no wonder that Moore was later described as the sapper's vicar to Luderum. With shirts and shorts tatty beyond belief, he was reportedly, quote, the sort of officer who fought with a revolver at arm's length and wrestled with an enemy.
That's an amazing quote. But just to interrupt you for a second, Kit, is that you're emphasizing this incredible adventurous nature, this almost like I've just watched the SAS Rogue Heroes show on the BBC, that LRDG SAS type there, but there must have been behind this a very methodical, almost academic understanding. Because when he was in India before the war, when it's lots of bridging and actual physical engineering stuff, to be able to leap straight into North Africa and be up to date with the mines, he must have been reading all the training manuals that were coming through. There must have been material coming through from England about where mine technology is going, so he must have been researching and carrying on that other side of it to be able to have those skills as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I assume so. And he was a voracious reader of technical manuals, and also he was a great mathematician. Right. And that would play a really important role in the battle and in his subsequent kind of mine clearing work. And because he was fabulous at pattern recognition, and he could see from you've got a mine here and you've got one over here and then one here. Use that to work out logically where the rest of the mines would be laid.
I can just see that these exploits of booby trapping the Jeep and so it would blow up with grenades. They must be reflected by, I'm assuming, evening after evening, he's sat in a tent or in a foxhole, just going through the latest data and as you say, looking at the maths, looking at the science behind mine technology to give him that other side of his skill set. Because being a bluff, resourceful, gung ho, leading with a rifle and revolver in hand type of officer is only one of the types of quality you need. When you're looking at something like mine technology.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And he kind of very much carried on that kind of element into his later life. So after he retired from the army and then the civil service, he ended up designing the first computer system for Reading University in the 80s. So he had this amazing ability to turn his kind of mechanical and methodological mind to all sorts of problems. Although I hasten to add, for anyone who's kind of wanting to listen to his interviews, which you can find on the Imperial War Museum website, and the articles he wrote, he was not a poet, however, and he remained very much a scientist and a mathematician to his day. And indeed, it was really as much his scientific and methodological brain that was the thing that landed him with the role of setting up the 8th Army Mine Clearing School in 1942. And he was absolutely committed to always being as humanly prepared as prepared as humanly possible. And in fact, he always rejected any suggestion that what he did was particularly dangerous or heroic, because he said, well, I was prepared. And if it was that dangerous, I wouldn't be here now. So yeah, you're right about that.
Okay, but I'll hand it back to you. It was my thoughts there that in exaggerating even the title of the show, we called it The Mad Moor, but there's an element of that side of thing that's very exciting and very draws people in to watch this show, but there must be, most of these people that have that side have this quieter side as well. Paddy Mayne comes to mind right now in the SAS, is that you see the brawling physicality, but you don't see the thinker behind it. You don't see the person who sits and considers the art of war, which I suppose is part of Montgomery's whole ethos in the Eighth Army, is to outthink the enemy as well as outperform them on the battlefield. So, and that involves intelligence and as you say there about your grandfather, preparation, research, and all that associated background, not
yes.
task. But anyway,
he notoriously brought along with him for his honeymoon reading, a book of logarithmic equations to do.
Oh.
I don't think it was exactly what my grandmother was expecting her husband would be up to. So I mentioned the school, the 8th Army Mine Clearance School, and that was the idea of this guy, Brigadier Frederick Quiche, and he was the CEO of the Royal Engineers in the Western Desert, and he was another Clifton man, and incidentally also the highest ranking Jew to ever serve in the British Army to that point. And is more recalled in a speech to the Royal Engineers Association in Cardiff in 1969, quote, Quiche, he got me into his caravan and told me that I was to open the 8th Army School of Minefield Clearance. He said that the nature of desert war had changed, that there was no longer an open flank and there were continuous deep minefields right across our front, which we should be prepared to force our way through against heavy opposition. A drill must be devised for clearing mines, just as there was a drill for loading and firing field guns. And it was Moore's work, alongside the chief instructor of the school, who was a Kiwi, Major A.N. Curry, who was later the chief engineers of the New Zealand Army, to come up with this drill. However, I think the phrase continuous and deep minefields rather undersells the nature of the access minefields, which were referred to as the Devil's Gardens, the British preferring the altogether more understated term mine marshes to describe them. And this is where I'm most likely to kind of foul up on the military history. But in my reading of the original documents and aided by the work of Richard Doherty, whose El Alamein, Turning Point in the Desert, is definitely the most comprehensive account of the German minefields. I think the German minefields work like this. So minefields were made up of 3 parts, which you can see from this diagram, which was produced for the American War Department's Technical Trends Journal in 1943. So first, what you had was an initial minefield of a width of about 500 to 1,000 yards and a depth of between 135 and 150 yards. And that would be bookended by barbed wire. And in this first minefield, you'd have dug-in battle outposts that were held by a company with machine gun support, as well as watchdogs. And they were always located in such a way as to allow interlocking fire. So that's the first chunk. Then you get what's known as a kind of a supposedly empty strip, which was between 1,000 and 2,000 yards wide. And that contained a lateral belt of mines on its inner and outer edge, with clear lines to reinforce the battle outposts, as well as a mixture of haphazardly laid mines within this area to try and confuse the enemy. Finally, you then had the third bit, which was another strip of 2,000 yards, which was delineated by more wire, where infantry and battalions deployed their additional companies and their battalion support weapons. Doherty described it thus, quote, "The basic defensive concept was that any attacker who made it through the outer minefields would be forced into the areas between the lateral belts and there run into the smaller minefields. At the same time, those areas would be bombarded by Axis artillery, which had already pre-registered those areas." So the idea is, you get through and you get kind of stuck in this middle section, and that's where the real damage is done. What about the mines themselves? So there are 2 main types of mine that are used at El Alamein. So the first is the German Teller anti-tank mine, which would easily blow off a tank track, but you could also detonate it by running on it. So hence the name Operation Lightfoot for Alamein, and why you had to walk through the minefields, which must have been a very eerie experience, and very counterintuitive one as well. Mm. The second type of mine was the really nasty one. This is the anti-personnel S mine, and they had, it doesn't show it on this diagram, but they had what were known as horns that came out from the top, and they'd be set off by brushing against the horns. And the nastiest element of this was that the S mine would then kind of leap into the air to about waist height, and then a secondary explosion would go out, causing around 250 metal balls to explode in all directions, causing horrific damage. So those were the two main German mines, but on top of them, the Germans also deployed a large number of British and Egyptian pattern mines, which they pulled in early operations or taken from stores captured at Tobruk and Gazala. And they also used a number of improvised mines. Usually they took the form of aerial bombs, which were wired up for detonation via booby traps, and often hidden in discarded equipment. And these had to be, it took quite a long time to clear. You also had the fact that the mines were often connected to one another. They were often booby trapped, and sometimes they contained anti-lifting devices within them. So usually a kind of thing that stuck to the bottom of the mine. So when you pulled it out, it would detonate one next to it. And the Germans even deployed wooden mines so that they'd escape metal detection, which was particularly cunning. And 2 days before the battle, Rommel's engineer commander estimated that access minefields around El Alamein contained 445,000 mines, of which thankfully only 14,000, or roughly 3%, were anti-personnel type S mines. And this was much, much less than they'd actually wanted. So the plan had been for it to be 2/3 anti-tank and 1/3 anti-personnel, but thankfully they didn't have the supplies in the stores to make that possible. So that's the mines themselves. What about the School of Minefield Clearance? So the first thing that happened was that the divisional Commanders Royal Engineer got together and they compared the different ways which their divisions had been involved in lifting the mines and what had worked best. And then a series of experiments were run at the school, which was based at Burg El Arab, and they created this particular drill. And I'll walk you through the drill, and you can get a sense of how it would work from this picture on the right. So the drill worked as follows. So first you'd have a recce party of 5 men who'd be led by an officer, and they direct that party along a compass bearing. And their main job is to find the near and then the far edge of a minefield. It sounds exhausting. So to do it, you'd be stooped down in this party, and you'd have to use the back of your hands going along the sand to try and feel any tripwires connected to any S mine. And when you got to the end of the minefield, you then put up a blue light, which would face back to friendly lines, and you'd have them at the near and the far end. So that's the recce party. After that, you'd have a tape laying party that went out, who'd mark out an initial 8-yard gap. You then had a detector party, which followed, and you can see that in the image here. And this would be supervised by an NCO. And they'd use the magnetic detectors, which by the time of Alamein, Second Battle of Alamein, were mainly of the Polish design. And they began arriving in the desert in reasonable quantities by the summer of 1942. Beforehand, the way that minefields have been cleared was through the prodding mechanism, which was to use your bayonet, on all fours, using your bayonet to just kick the sand and see if you felt anything. And it turned out through the experiments that they did at the minefield clearing school that you could clear minefields much quicker using these detectors, except when you're on rocky ground where you had to go back to use the bayonet. So within this detector party, you'd be echeloned back at 10 yards. So this was if one group blew up a mine, then you wouldn't kill the whole lot. You'd have the detector, who was known as number 1, and they'd be doing the sweeping. And behind him would come the number 2, whose job it was to place a metal cone over every mine. And that number 2 was also responsible for the terrifying job, and it just gives me kind of shivers to think about it, of disabling the S mine. And the way you did that was by taking a 1/2-inch nail and gently tapping it into the firing pinhole of the mine, all the while trying not to brush up against any horns. Then there's number 3, and you can see them. That's the chap right at the back lying down, and he was responsible for pulling or detonating the mines. Each detector team could clear a gap of 8 yards, progressing at a speed of 3 yards a minute. And you needed 3 teams to make a 24-yard gap.
And do we know whether there was any like aptitude testing for the personnel as well in certain units? For example, an infantry platoon, certain people would be given to put towards the anti-tank elements or wireless because they're showing particular skills. Would a similar thing happen here? And I'm thinking particularly the skilling just isn't steady hand and nerves. I mean, was that part of the process at the school?
Yeah, I don't know about that. There are records about the school at the National Archives. I haven't had as much time to get over as I'd like to. I certainly know that there were, as I'll mention later, only particular people would volunteer or were selected to do the proving of the minefield, which is the last element of it, which involved driving across the cleared gap in a sandbagged Bedford truck, and that was deemed probably the most nerve-wracking of all the jobs, and only only experienced and particular people were asked to do that job. So just to carry on, you'd have a gap marking party alongside all of this, and they were really important. Their job was to delineate the edge of the minefield by hammering in posts with 2 lights on them. And you have a green light on to mark the inside of the gap and an orange one on the outside. And you get a really good sense of just how dangerous all this was by the fact that each gap marking party also included a medical orderly, 4 stretcher bearers, and a reserve party of 1 NCO and 6 sappers to replace any casualties that might occur. So it was not without danger. Probably alongside the proving vehicle chap, the most stressful job was probably to be the detector operator, because you're going along with your headphones on, listening to that telltale sound to denote that there's metal underneath you and the presence of a mine, and therefore you can't hear what's going on around you. No idea. And you're doing this in the dark. You can't hear. You're crouched over and you're walking through a minefield. And particularly worrying, you've got your detector, and therefore if you swish too far, you might set off any undetected S mine. So only the guy who was in charge of the proving vehicle, which had to be designed or redesigned so they had an extended steering column on it. So if it blew up, it wouldn't take you along with it. Only he probably had a more stressful job than the detector. So the whole thing apparently was referred to as like a Dante-esque edition of the Lord Mayor's show. And between the 26th of August, when the first class began, and the 20th of October, when it shut up shop, the Minefield Clearance School ran seven courses, each lasting 8 days, with space for 8 training teams of engineer units. Apparently, according to one account, the high point of each class was the competition held on the last day between different detector teams, where there was a competition to see who could clear a dummy minefield fastest, but crucially without missing any mine. It turns out that the winning team were awarded 4 bottles of beer, which seems to me a good example of the stingy provision of alcohol that my grandfather would later become notorious for at family parties.
Right, okay.
Monty came himself as part of his kind of tour of the different battlefield schools that were set up. And apparently my grandfather referred to Monty's visit to the school as being like a tonic. It was a huge kind of, a huge boost to morale, and a recognition of what they're doing was seen as being integral to the operation and important, and rather than just a mere afterthought. I mean, and in fact, when it comes to so many things to do with the battle, minefields really played a crucial role. So, in fact, the very date of the operation, which was fixed for late October, rather than September, as Churchill had wanted, was all designed around the minefield clearing part, because the clearing parties needed a waxing moon to be able to do their work. So that's the minefield clearing school. What about the battle? So as you've no doubt heard, the plan for Operation Lightfoot was for the infantry of 30 Corps to attack across a broad front in the north central sector of the line between the coast and the Qattara Depression. And it was the engineers of 10 Corps who were to clear 2 corridors through the minefields, through which 1st Armoured Division would pass, that's kind of almost due west, and 10th Armoured Division would pass then on the southwest. The idea that the tanks would then establish themselves on what was known as the Pearson Bound, which after much scouring of maps turns out to be an almost imaginary ridge, barely perceptible at all. That's roughly 2,000 yards beyond the infantry objectives. And the idea was to get the tanks up there so they could repel the inevitable counterattacks. All the while, there's a diversionary attack taking place to the south, led by 13 Corps, the idea being to draw the Axis forces away from the central objective. Now, the job of actually clearing the minefields in the north central sector fell to the 3rd Cheshire Field Squadron and 571 and 573 Army Field Companies. And 4 gaps were planned there, known as bottle, hat, boat, and ink. And they had these names because what you do is you take a jerry can or similar and stencil out the boat or the ink or the bottle and have a light inside the jerry can, so that if you're driving along, you'd be able to see which track you're on. And it's the last 2 gaps of that list, boat and ink, which were to be cleared by the 3rd Cheshire Field Squadron, to whom my grandfather Moore returned as officer in commanding after his time at the Minefield Clearance School. The whole job was made particularly difficult, and I mentioned how much my grandfather liked to be as prepared as possible. It was made very difficult because reconnaissance patrols from 10 Corps were not allowed, for the very good reason that that area of the front was being held by the 51st Highland Division. And as Moore later put it, quote, "If the Scottish front was found to be swarming with Sassenachs, the enemy were bound to smell something." So yeah, you didn't want to have this situation where non-Scot Englishmen were found in what was meant to be a Scottish sector of the line. You didn't want to give the game away. Nonetheless, he was able to secure special permission to join one night patrol led by the Seaforth Highlanders, advancing about 1,000 yards into no man's land. Although we'll never know whether his attempt at a Scottish accent would have fooled anyone, because reportedly all they found was one Italian soldier running away in the moonlight. But during the day, before the battle, the men of 3rd Field Squadron assembled in the 2nd Seaforth Battalion area, arriving in driblets, with Moore describing the day of the 23rd of October being stuck in a shallow trench as, quote, one of the hottest, thirstiest, and most anxious I can remember, end quote. So at 9:40 p.m., the artillery barrage began. Of course, as we know, the largest undertaken by the British Army since the First World War. And the recce parties that I mentioned as the first part of the minefield clearance operation passed through the British minefields and began reconnoitering, even better, the enemy minefields 45 minutes later. Seeing the blue light of the recce party 3/4 of a mile ahead, Moore moved up in his scout car behind boat party, only to witness the pilot vehicle explode as it hit a rogue mine laid in front of the main element of the German minefield. The detective party decided that wisely, therefore, it was time to start doing the clearance work. But unfortunately, what happened was that a shell hit that abandoned lorry, which went up like a light, illuminating the area where the sappers were working and drawing all the nearby LMG fire. And in a characteristic piece of understatement, Moore's published account describes this as a setback, with the sappers illuminated in a most uncomfortable way, leading to an exciting few minutes. So that was his account. I found a different one that said, quote, Moore immediately went forward and put out the fire. This involved walking around the truck several times, although it was now the target of every enemy weapon that could be brought to bear, and was hit several times by machine gun bullets. So yeah, definitely an exciting few minutes.
Wow.
After the confirming sapper party led by Lieutenant Van Grooten, South African, dispatched the machine gun post, with Grooten apparently personally shooting the gunner and the rest running away, work on clearing what was boat gap continued, the drill working exactly as it was intended. And this was what was so important about the Minefield Clearance School and the amount of preparation and practice they did. Everything was designed so that the sappers and those in the clearing parties wouldn't have to think during the clearance. They'd been so well trained, that they'd be able to do their work without having to worry about what was going on and not be unfazed by all the events going around them. One of those events Moore describes when he went to Ink Gap as a rather eerie experience. He writes, quote, suddenly long lines of men abreast appeared behind us with rifles at the high port, their bayonets shining in the moonlight. Their faces seemed blackened, and they spoke to each other in an unintelligible tongue. And of course, what he saw was actually a Maori rifle company of the 6th Brigade. It's not who he was expecting. So despite all of these events and the destruction of the pilot vehicle and other delays, by 1 a.m., the first of the German minefields had been gapped and marked by ink and boat companies, which left the sappers working only 30 minutes behind schedule. And at this point, they thought they were doing pretty well. But it was the second minefield that proved to be a much harder challenge. The New Zealanders were facing stiff opposition on the Mitiana Ridge. So with considerable incoming fire and communications not working, they didn't have the high frequency sets at this point. Moore was forced to hair off personally to try and find more infantry support for his sappers. And wandering around, he couldn't find the New Zealanders Company HQ, but he did find the services of a small platoon who had halted on the edge of the ridge and were able to provide his sappers with cover and fire. At this point, with kind of things slowing down, he did briefly consider finding an alternative route through the minefield. But then he chanced upon an S mine and was nearly blown to pieces, and thus decided it was not a good idea to change plans. The sappers pressed on, going through boat and ink under intense fire, with one corporal fatally shot and several sappers wounded as they attempted to sweep the minefield. And eventually they get to the edge of the minefield to find that the blue light that was meant to be there had long been shot away. So with just 20 minutes before dawn, Moore raced back on foot through the boat gap in a tearing hurry in order to move up the Sherwood Rangers and their Grant tanks. So this map shows the location of where the Sherwood Rangers were, which is in green, and where their final objective on the Pearson bound was meant to be. That's noted in purple. And with first light appearing, Moore ran in front, guiding the first tank through the gap in the minefield, only for it to be hit by an anti-tank gun. The desert just really kind of lights up, and any kind of element of disguise, it goes very quickly with the dawn breaking. Standing alone on the enemy side of the ridge, apparently he jumped from tank to tank, trying to guide them through as the sky brightened and anti-tank and machine gun fire poured down on the gap at close range. Nearly 30 years later, he recalled, quote, "How odd a coloured light appeared in the grey dawn." But it was clear that the Sherwood Rangers could not get through, despite the best efforts of a Royal Horse Artillery battery, who engaged in a crash action in an attempt to silence enemy anti-tank weapons. As a result, Moore turned back and collected his sappers, moving them behind a ridge. As Moore later recalled, quote, "So ended the first phase of 10th Armoured Division's operations, those in which the sappers were most intimately concerned. We had breached the minefields as ordered, but that first night had just not been long enough. Whether another hour would have given the armour a clear run, I don't honestly know." End quote. All in all, it'd been a very expensive operation. Out of a deployed strength of 150 men in 3rd Cheshire Field Squadron, there had been 25 casualties, though thankfully only 5 of these turned out later to prove fatal. Looking back at all of it, Moore in part blamed himself for the failure of the operation. His obsession, his words, not mine, with getting Boat Gap completed despite opposition, instead of perhaps focusing resources elsewhere. Yet at the same time, he recognised that Boat had the least scattered mines beyond the gap, and that sidestepping 2 armoured columns in the dark would have been a very hazardous operation, and also would have gone against the plan with all the dangers that that entailed. Most of all, though, he blamed the lack of effective radios, the absence of high-frequency sets in particular, meaning that his communication system was basically him running to and fro. And while the Moore counted the sappers' operation a failure, he was awarded a DSO for his effort, as well as his subsequent role in the battle. Apparently, he commanded his men in further mine clearing and tank destroying operations for 12 days straight, which involved further wrestling with Germans. As the citation for his DSO concluded, quote, "The tireless energy, inflexible determination, and supreme courage of this officer were an inspiration, not only to his unit, but also to the many officers and men beside whom he fought." Now, whether Moore would have been disappointed that the recommendation for a VC was downgraded to a DSO personally by Montgomery, we will never know. You can see the writing there on the citation. But I think from my perspective, I think he'd have actually been quite pleased. I think it suited his modesty, but it also, more importantly, ensured that he wasn't going to be spared from any more fighting, which was the thing that, frankly, he enjoyed the most and believed he was best equipped to do.
Yeah. As a Victoria Cross recipient, there's the chance of he goes off to do PR work and speaking to the king and lots of champagne receptions and more briefings, things like that, which seems to me the last thing he'd want to do.
Yeah.
Especially in a sense, because as you said there, we'll talk about combined ops in a minute when we talk about the questions, but this operation had been not a complete success. So there's a sense to me that they would want to be an effort to right the wrongs and improve this system and being taken out now on a partial victory would have been just frustrating.
Yeah, I'm absolutely sure you're right. I mean, and he did count, the operation a failure, but he remained very, very proud of the sappers and the part they played in the battle. I was chatting to my godmother actually last week, who told me about a letter that she got from not that she found in some of my grandfather's papers from a private in Cheshire field company, talking about how my grandfather had gone around and personally spent 3 days traveling around, personally thanking every single member of the field squadron. Something that apparently the men were very, very pleased with. And there's a lovely line in there that said, we would have followed you anywhere. So he did, and that was part of the reason for all of the preparation, is that although he was very brave, undoubtedly, he valued human life and other people's human life extraordinarily highly, and would never ask anyone to do something that he wasn't willing to do himself.
Sounds very much like he's from the whole Monty school of leadership. That's exactly what Zita last week was saying about Montgomery, is that if you prepare well enough, do your groundwork, do your studies, understand the art of war, then when you go for it, you're going to theoretically reduce the casualties, your own casualties. And it seems that your grandfather very much is in that ethos, is that get the job done by as much preparation as possible, because at the end of the day, it is human life you're risking. And if you can come out of this with one life saved because of an extra hour of study, then it's all been good.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe we'll talk about his post-war career a little bit later, but this serves him very well in the desert, but it actually causes him quite a lot of trouble when he becomes more senior in the army. He's obsessed with preparation, and he expects people, he's a real taskmaster, and he expects people to prepare as hard as he did, and quite frankly, often they didn't, and he was not a great diplomat, and therefore, when he saw someone being slack, he would tell them. And this caused quite a lot of problems when he was commanding in Malaya, particularly when he was working with a particular Australian officer. When this really kind of his particular approach to leadership worked well, perhaps at the operational level, but when it came to strategy and delegation, that wasn't something he was quite so good at. And I mentioned, I mentioned his kind of great respect for human life, and that applied very much to the enemy as well. He was of the school that this was a kind of a gentleman's battle and an honest battle. And although he had the Terence Cuneo picture in the dining room, the thing that I found most moving growing up, and still do, is this picture on the right. Which is a picture of a young German soldier that he found in the desert and liberated and took back home. And it was interesting to me that this was hung in the downstairs bathroom, and because it was fascinating, because it's a place, it's a solitary place. It's not somewhere where it invites conversation. And he, as I said, he never liked to talk about. He was proud, but he never liked to really talk about what happened. And in fact, I think the thing that he'd be most proud of, and most pleased by, was the fact that nearly 50 years later, the researchers from the U.S. Army actually scoured the National Archives to find records from the 8th Army Minefield Clearance School to look at how mines were lifted in the desert. And it's clear to this day from what Sean was saying to me the other day, that there are still worthwhile work being done studying how sappers cleared those devil's gardens. Anyway, wow. So there you go. That's my grandfather and his role in the Battle of El Alamein.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, the first thing I'm thinking about that it highlights is that the recurring theme, one of the recurring themes has been the that El Alamein is a step towards the improvement of combined arms, but it's by no means the perfection of it. And the fact that he highlights the lack of the radios and having to go out on foot is the sort of thing that would be improved later on with better communication. So, you know, combined ops is at the heart of El Alamein. It's definitely better than the earlier campaigns, but there's room for improvement. That's the first thing I'm thinking about. And I'm also thinking about the numerical superiority that Montgomery and the 8th Army had, which it did have, but it has to come down to these brave sappers going out and starting this massive, great snowball rolling, so to speak, in that someone has to be the first guy to step out there, and your grandfather and his sappers are amongst the very first people stepping out there into literally no man's land with a skill set you've developed, but an unknown amount of minds ahead of you, and varying things that can go wrong, that can happen, circumstances that you can only prepare for to a certain extent. And then when that works, then everyone else, infantry and tanks, pours in behind. But the responsibility on these sapper units is extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think that they're also very well aware of how much what responsibility there was, and there was a lot of learning that had already happened. So and this was the real point of the 8th Army School of Minefield Clearance, is that this was not the first time in which they'd tried to gap minefields. Different divisions had been involved in it before, but it was the first time that they'd come together to talk about it, to learn from each other about what they had done, and to kind of break down some of those divisional divides, and also divides between kind of different Duke forces, and to really engage in kind of experimentation as well. I mean, I didn't mention it, but it's also at that minefield clearance school where they developed the kind of the flail tanks, or not develop them, but test them out for the first time. Although they weren't of great use during.
It came up in, I forget which show it came up in, but the Matilda Scorpions were a signal of how, again, it was going to be a technology that was going to come in to be much better later on in the war. But at this time in North Africa, it was not working. But the clues were there that it could be used. But yeah, I think that came up in the talk with Glyn Harper about the New Zealanders. I forget which way. It may have come up in a couple, but. Yeah. We had a question from Ian Carr about the list of your grandfather's decorations, because there was DSO twice, MC, wasn't it?
Yeah, so he got his MC as a result of that first action I mentioned in the Western Desert, where he gets captured. He gets a DSO in for this action at Second Battle of Alamein. He is then gets parachuted into Yugoslavia to be the main liaison officer with Tito's partisans, and is involved in various bridge blowing up operations in Yugoslavia, for which he receives the second bar. Sorry, the first bar. And the third one comes when he's in Korea. And that is interesting because that's another minefield-based one. And what happened there was an American soldier had wandered into a minefield, and there was no time to go back to HQ. It was an UN-laid minefield. There was no time to get HQ and find the map of the minefield, because this guy was panicking and started wandering around. So my grandfather, using that kind of pattern recognition, something I'm afraid I absolutely not inherited at all, infuriatingly, he was able to work out from what little he knew about the way the mines he could see, how they had been laid, a path for through the minefield, and he walked in and got this American GI out. She got that final bar on his DSO.
Wow.
Yeah, he was a very, very decorated soldier, but he is somewhat stymied by this this leadership style that works very well in certain situations, and not in others. So he ends up in Malaya. I'll just show you this side, where he is the commander of the 28th Infantry Brigade, and there he is in Malaya, and he is reported to have very good relations, and does have very good relations with Commonwealth Armed Forces in Korea, but he has these personality clashes in Malaya, and that really stymies his career. And he goes back to Whitehall and is a desk officer, and it really doesn't suit him. And with a young family to support, eventually he leaves the army and joins the civil service, and becomes becomes a kind of principal in the Ministry of Agriculture, before eventually leaving and, as I said, kind of working on computers.
I mean, it's an extraordinary career, and it's interesting that some of these people who are really good at one thing, there's elements of their person that they're not as good at, and the diplomacy side of things. It's come up in the discussions about Montgomery and Rommel, is that to be a modern general in 1942, you've got to be able to be good on tactically, but you've also got to be able to deal with the press. You've got to be able to get on with people. You've got to understand your PR role. And some generals are not good at one aspect, but they really shine at other aspects. And it's it's very difficult to be good at everything. And I suppose in these days, a modern general today in 2022, even more a range of qualities you have to be good at. And it's brilliant. But we've got a great question that I don't know whether you'll know the answer to from Philip. There was back about the mine school. Were there lessons learned from clearing German minefields that were then applied to organizing Allied minefields? So that's the interesting thing, because we've talked about mines today in terms of the enemy using them against the Allies, or the Axis using the Allies. But of course, mines are an integral part of the British system as well. So was that question relevant? Does that make sense? An answer to it?
Yeah, I just don't know. Onto that. I would assume so. I know, and then assume that there would be if the way in which the Minefields Clearance School was organised and the impetus behind it was kind of an example, then surely some kind of lessons learned operation would occur. Unfortunately, the chap who's really important in this, Brigadier Kirsch, is later killed in 43, and so that kind of perhaps might have dampened. Or not had led to such kind of institutional backing for this sort of thing, but it would suggest to me that there probably was, and it's interesting, as I kind of mentioned, the way that the Germans were literally borrowing British mines to use against the British, and I'd be fascinated to know if that happened afterwards, if they picked up the German and the minefields, and used German ones later on in the war.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting aspect, and I think, and I'd like to do a show. I'll find someone from the Royal Engineers who could perhaps talk about this, because we know that, for example, tank development, there's shared suspension systems that are used universally, but I don't know at what point mine technology kind of separated and they went their separate ways, and how much overlap there was, because to the layman, a mine is a mine is a mine, but from what I know, the British system might have been entirely different to the German system, and therefore not much learning to be taken from one side to the other. I mean, I know we've talked about sea mines with Nick Stanley. The German system and the British system there were some overlaps, but again, they were very separate. Radar, there were overlaps, but they were very separate systems. So that's an interesting topic that we've been given for a future show there. And also the Yugoslavia, if you find yourself with a spare few moments, because I'm doing a week on the Balkans at some point in sort of March, April next year. So anything about Tito and relationships there with that would be really fascinating, because it's something that I went to Croatia and Bosnia in July, and I've started reading extensively about the Yugoslavia in World War II, and realizing it's an absolutely underexplored and underwritten about theatre, and especially in English language. So but that's a future thing. But anyway, it's absolutely been amazing talking to you, Kit. So
Thank you.
I'd be happy for you to come back on when your book about the Conservative Party and their attitudes of World War II, because we don't just talk about battle stuff. We're happy to talk about other aspects of World War II history.
Yes, well, I realise now that I've taken almost twice as long to write this bloody book as the war itself took. So,
Well, if it's any consolation, John Parshall, who was my guest last Tuesday, is 12 years into working on his book about 1942. And I asked him how close it to be. He's another 2 years, he said. So that'll have been 14 years. So that's a considerable time to write about one year. And I want to do other years as well. So it gives hope
well, at least,
for all
yeah,
of
at
us
least
who've
I've got
these
6
projects.
in mind.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
anyway.
I have to say, my editor at AUP is determined that the book goes out while there's still a Conservative government. So I've really got to get.
Oh yeah, you better get on with it then. Yeah. Well, it's been absolutely amazing talking to you, Dr. Kit. So I'll see you again next time, hopefully.
Thank
and
you,
folks, I
Paul.
will see you all again at 7 p.m. tonight for our talk with James Colvin. So cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Bye.